Okay, this is a follow-up to tutorial number 4. I want to go and touch on some of the things we did. I want to do that in the hierarchy here. Right? In the hierarchy, we now have two classes, Demo App Delegate and Root View Controller, and of course you see the declaration implementation, so they correspond to one another. You should see that in your programming. If we open them up, you will notice that we have, as we said before, methods. These are objects and variables. We'll get to that in a second. More methods and a variable. And another thing here called a property. I want to talk about the differences in what you're seeing here. Methods appear in the implementation file, which is the .m file, right? And the app delegate is going to have its set of methods. All app delegates have the same set of methods. Similarly, to be more correct, all table view controllers or table view style classes have all of these same types of methods. All right. So, going back to the object here was created from the property, and it's an outlet. These outlets, right, one's a window class with the variable window, one's a navigational controller with the variable navigation controller. These outlets become objects by virtue of these two lines. Right? No matter which one it is. When we synthesize those objects, we create the variables. So we start with an object, an outlet. We set properties for it, and then when you synthesize it, we create the actual variable. Don't believe me, watch what happens if we take out these lines of code here. Watch this. Keep your eye right over here. Okay? Those were the variables. Look what happens. Notice the underscores went away. Alright? Which tells you right away that, I'll bring them back, there they are, that the variables here are created as a virtue of synthesizing the properties for the object. So object properties are synthesized for it, then we get a variable. All right. Here, a little bit interesting. This array is already a variable. It's created in this line here. It's declared, I should say, in this line here. We didn't declare any variables here. We simply set the properties for the object, and by virtue of that it created a variable. But here we declared a variable. The properties of that variable, we said set them this way, and the variable itself is there and the properties are here. Notice that the variable did not come from synthesizing. It came from declaring it. So in Xcode, when you declare a variable here, it becomes the variable. When you set the properties, they become the properties. Alright? And if we go into the root view controller .m or the declaration file, we synthesize that as well. What we're doing is we're synthesizing the properties here. When we come back to here, right, there are no variables declared, but we create the object and its properties here. When we come here, when we synthesize it, we create the variable for the object. So in one case we went from object to variable, in another case we went from variable to property. All right. Keep that in mind. The code again will be posted. And that's the two different ways. You can either create the object and then synthesize the properties, thus creating the variable, or create the variable and or declare the variable, I should say, and then create the property. And when you synthesize it, the variable is created. Notice there's no real object here. You have a variable and a property. In any event, so I want to go back to the code in the table view. I want to do this quickly because I haven't got a lot of time. We wrote some code down in here, right? And with this self again, we created this array, we loaded this array with objects, and we initialized it rather with objects. We looked at the self, we looked at the class, or in this case the root view controller class, and we looked at the list data variable, which is here, and we said set that equal to the array, and then release the array. And what that does now, this array is stored within the list data variable. Again, the reason we did this is because we cannot start with an array from scratch. We can start with a variable, we can create the array, which is what we did, we can set them equal, and then get rid of the array, which is what we did. When we unload, we set it equal to nothing or nil, so we close out the value of it, and then with the deallocate, okay, we release it because when we created the properties for it, we retained it. All right. Hopefully that flows for you. And as far as the other methods here, we kind of went over them briefly. Number of sections in table view, again, we only have one continuous table view. There's only one section. Number of rows in per section is a simple concept. It is, give me the count of this array, of the objects in this array. So if I had 50 objects, that would be the number of rows I would need. In this case, it's 7 for all the dwarfs. So I'm returning the count of the array. How many objects are in the array variable. Back down here, we created a row variable, and since it's an NSUI integer class, it doesn't need an asterisk. It's an integer. Integers don't require the asterisk. I'm going to keep enforcing this for you so you know. And we're going to set it equal to the index path row. Equivalently, we could have had index path dot row. Either one would have worked. And this gives us one variable to place in here as opposed to two. Cleans up your code. It's really nice. This line again, look at the cell, look at the text label with that property within the cell, and the text. So we want to set the text equal to the object that we're at in the array at the index for that row. So in the case of Dopey, for example, if that's our dwarf in that array at that object at index for that row, Dopey will become the text of that cell. Pretty simple. One other thing, final thing here. You notice these methods, ID, void, there's words in the front of these methods. Let me see if we've got one. There's a bool, right? This is what the method returns. All methods, I should say, return or can return something, right? In this case here, it's an NSI integer is the return value. And what is the count of the list data? An integer. So it's going to return the integer value of the data count. So it's consistent. In the case of a bool, I can return yes here instead of, I could type this in and say return equals yes. And then, whoops, I apologize for that, yes, and then comment this out. And what that will do is, in this method, by the way, it's a very specific method. Hang on. Not return equals yes, but return yes. Okay. This method tells me when I rotate my iPod or iPad, which orientation do I want to see? The initial line said just give me portrait. This line, by returning yes, give me any orientation. If I turn it upside down, sideways, backways, whatever ways you want to, It'll take every orientation, but it has to be a bool, and it's really returning a bool, and that means that this value here is a bool. It's a numerical number stored that's going to give you the UI interface orientation, portrait only. When you return void, it doesn't return anything. It just works on something. So void returns nothing. Void, for example, to load or unload, returns nothing. There's no value. It just says, don't return anything, run this code. Right? So methods have a return value. Some can be integers, some can be booleans, some can be void. Let's go over here just as a demo app delegate quickly. You got a bool here, right? It returns yes. Right? So you know why. Look here and see what it returns. Here it's a void, nothing to return. And that's really our follow-up for tonight. I will post tutorial 5 shortly, and I will see you later. Take care.